Underneath the cache settings are our velocity settings. Now if you've taken a physics class, you'll probably remember that velocity is a vector, meaning that it has both a speed and a direction. So as we change these values, we're changing how fast the particles are moving and also in which direction they're heading. So the first value is the normal value. So if we set this to 10, the particles are going to be emitted with a speed of 10 in the direction of the object's face normals. If we set this to 0, and all of these are set to 0, that means that it's not going to have any initial velocity, and the only movement is going to happen because of gravity, and they're just going to drip down. Now underneath normal we have a tangent value, and increasing this will shoot the particles out of the face's tangent, and we have a rotation value for that tangent as well, in case we want to change that up. Next to those on the right we have options for the X, Y, and Z axes for the emitter object. So by increasing this, you can see that our particles are now shooting out of the object in the X direction. But one thing to be aware of is this is a local direction. If we rotate our object, the particles are also going to rotate with it because it's using the object's local axis and not the global axis. If you want it to shoot straight in the X direction, you're going to have to apply the rotation with Control A and apply rotation. Now underneath all of those is the random value, and this will just give it a random direction and a random speed. But it'll never be a speed greater than the number you set it at. So if we set it to 10, it's never going to shoot faster than 10 in whichever direction it happens to be going. Now this last value is the object velocity, and even if we set this all the way to 1, we can see that it's not doing anything at all. And that's because it's using the velocity of our object, and since our object isn't moving, there's no velocity to be had. But as we move our object around, the faster we move our object, the faster our particles are going to be emitted in the same direction that our object is traveling. This also works for rotation and also for scale. I'm going to set these back to their defaults with a normal velocity of 1. The next thing I want to show you is collision. So on the second layer I have a plane, and if I enable both layers at once, you can see the particles are falling through the plane. But I may want the particles to bounce off the plane as if it were the ground. So to do that I'm going to select the plane, go to the physics panel, right here in the properties window, and choose collision. And that's going to make this a collision object. However, you'll notice that the particles are still falling through, and that's because they're on separate layers. We need them to be on the exact same layer if they're going to interact with each other. So if I press M to move the layer to the first layer, now I might need to update this particle cache real quick. And once I do that, then the particles are now bouncing off of this plane. So we have a few options in the collision properties here. First being permeability. As we increase this, more particles are going to pass through the surface and ignore the collision. And the lower I set this, the fewer are going to be able to pass through. There's also an option for stickiness to allow the particles to stick to the surface. Underneath that, there's a checkbox for kill particles, which will make the particles disappear as soon as they touch, so they're not going to bounce or move anywhere else. They're just going to die on impact. Next, there's particle dampening. So the lower I set this, the more the particles are going to bounce and retain all of their velocity, but in the opposite direction. But the more I increase this, the less the particles are going to bounce. There's also a nice random value here. As well as particle friction, which I guess we can see this a little bit more clearly if we increase the particle dampening all the way up. You can see how they're slipping across the surface after they hit it. If we increase the particle friction, the particles are going to slip less and less. And there's also a random value for that as well. There's a few other options here on the right, but that only has to do with soft body and cloth, so we won't get to that in this video.